Well, hello guys. Welcome to every generation of the Glock. Um, these are all the guns from my personal collection so far, uh, released all the way from the first ever Glock created up to the latest, which is the Gen 6 here. Now, this is probably going to be a boring video for a lot of people, but to those who love Glocks or just want to see the differences between every single generation made thus far. That's what this video is going to be about. So we're going to take a close-up look. So these are just firearms from my collection. I bought all these just because I personally like Glock, and it's just something I like to do is collecting firearms. But yeah, so right here, every generation of the Glock, every major generation at least, or the couple that aren't on this table here that are extremely hard to find, and I'll talk about those later. But this is pretty much every major generation of the Glock. So we'll just go ahead and jump right into it. So first I want to start off with this pistol here. This is what's called the Glock P80, right? Now this one's not a real Glock P80. So the reason we can't get real ones here in the United States is because they were only ever made for the Austrian military back when Glock first started producing firearms. The reason they called it the P80, it was called the Pistola 80. They named it 80 because it came out in 1980. It was officially adopted by the Austrian military in 1980. So anyway, this one is a reproduction of that original pistol. Now it is identical to the Gen 1 Glock 17. But like I said, back in 1980, they called it the P80. They didn't call it the Glock 17 until, I believe, 1982 when they started producing them for the civilian population. But anyway, here's what it looks like. So like I said, obviously it's not a real P80, so this one's a reproduction one made by Lipsy's, I believe. And so it's not 100% correct as to what the original P80s looked like, but it's a nice representation or recreation of it. So the first thing we got like these pebble grips right here, half moon cutout on the bottom, basic roll marks, all it said, the Glock logo, P80, the caliber, all around. But I'm not going to show you too much about this one here in particular. So we'll start off with the real Glock Gen 1 here. So this one right here is a real Generation 1 Glock 17. This one in particular, after tracking down the serial number, I've dated to March 1988 is the date of manufacture for this one here. So I believe they started importing these pistols into the United States in early 1986, and I believe they stopped making the Generation 1 in late 1988, maybe early 1989. I'm not sure the exact date, but this one right here is produced in March of 1988, so it's a later production model here. But just looking at it from the front to the back, I'll start off with on the front. First off, you have no rails. A lot of the firearms these days have rails so you can mount lights and stuff. These original Glocks here did not. So just nothing here. The roll marks, Glock 17, Austria is of course where these are made, and 9mm there on the side. Here the grip. So just like that P80 that I showed you, this is what the real one looked like. The smooth pebble textured grip is what they called it. So definitely it's very, very slippery, and I can see why Glock went away from this pretty quick, because I think people it's extremely slippery, right? Another thing, you got a half moon cut down here. Now the reason we have that is because these original Glock 1 mags are not what they called drop free mags. So whenever you'd hit the mag release, they weren't supposed to drop. Now this one is an original Gen 1 Glock magazine. However, over time it has become basically a drop free magazine. So now when I hit it, it drops right out. But originally it wasn't supposed to do that. When you would hit the mag release, you'd have to actually pull it out right there, and that's why that half moon cut is there. So yeah, very basic gun. And then I believe the finish that these original Glocks had is what they called the Tinnifer finish, which was extremely strong. Some people say that it didn't wear very nice, with holster wear and stuff. But but some people still say that the Tinnifer finish is the strongest finish Glock ever made. So yeah, that's the basic. That's what it looks like from the outside. On this side, right here on the ejector, there is no loaded chamber indicator at all. You know, this is just a flat surface here. And then it does have the original Glock U-dot sights. We'll get into this later, but as you can see, it's kind of turning yellow now. And a lot of these original white U-dot sights started turning yellow over time. So that's why that looks like that. Now, one thing on the inside that would be cool to see is the original Glocks here. Whenever you take it apart, the big thing here that a lot of people don't know is that these original springs here were non-captive, you know, meaning that the guide rod could be removed from the spring entirely, right? So, you know, that's what they originally had. It's kind of a pain to put it back in because you kind of got to line it up yourself. It's not too bad, but, you know, once you put it back in, there you go. So a non-captive guide rod. And then, you know, I'm sure there's some other internal things. This isn't going to be like a super in-depth video. It's just going to be like some of the, you know, main generational changes. So there we go. So that is a Gen 1 Glock 17 there. So next, we're going to move on to the Glock 17 Gen 2. Now here is this one. This one that I have here was a law enforcement traded one. It's not in as quite nice condition as that one. But, so here's what it looks like. So still you have this pebble texture. However, instead of it wrapping around the entire grip, like on the Gen 1, they just put it on the sides, you know, left, right there. And then they have this different texture right here on the front and the back. And, you know, you can feel right off the bat that the texture is a lot nicer. It's not quite as slippery. It's still pretty slippery compared to the more modern Glocks, which we'll look at here, but you know, it is improved over the Gen 1. The other thing is the slide is still finished in the Tinifer finish. They did still offer it with the same U-dot sights, which you can see these ones are turning yellow now. Like I said, this one was a law enforcement trade-in, so it originally had the Glock night sights, but it looked like somebody took them off at some point and put these standard ones back on. But yeah, looking around, it still had the half moon cuts. So I believe some of the early Gen 2s still had the non-drop free mags, which is why you still got the half moon cut there. Still no rail for any lights. And then the biggest difference on the inside here is that this is the first generation where they started using a captive guide rod and spring for the recoil assembly. So now when you take a look at the spring here, it is captive. You can't remove the spring from the actual guide rod, which also makes it quite a bit easier to put back together, you know, after you clean it or disassemble it. So, you know, that's the major thing with the Glock Gen 2 here. Now, I also want to say this was also the first generation where they started producing calibers other than just 9mm, right? So the reason I'm collecting 17s is because that's truly the only gun that you can get from Glock that came in every single generation, including the Gen 1. Because I believe they might have produced the Glock 19 as well in Gen 1, maybe in a very limited number, but, you know, incredibly hard to find. So this is the first generation where they start producing, you know, 40 caliber. I believe they also introduced 10mm and 45 during this generation here. So yeah, that's the Gen 2 right there. Now we'll move on to the Gen 3. So the Gen 3, here's what it looks like. So this one looked a bit different. So still like the Gen 1 and Gen 2, you still got the pebble textures on the sides of the grip. Just like the Gen 2 though, you now have this new texture on the front and the back. Also in the Gen 3, they introduced these finger grooves here. And then this is the first generation also with a rail, so you can mount you know, lights and lasers or whatever you want on the bottom. And then they also started going to a different finish here. I believe it was like a gas nitride finish, which was different from the Tinifer, obviously. They say it wears a little nicer. I'm not sure about how the, you know, how it actually performs, if it's any, you know, better or worse than the Tinifer, but that's the finish they started using. The other thing you see is the half moon cut is now gone, because now all Generation 3 Glocks came with the drop-free mags. I do want to point out that some really early Generation 3s did have the half moon cut. And then another thing here, which they started doing from the Gen 2 to the Gen 3. If you look here, the pin here, which basically holds the entire gun together, but mainly the trigger assembly, single pin design on the Gen 2 and the Gen 1. Now on the Gen 3, they started going to a dual pin design. Now the reason they started doing that is because they found that, back when the original 17s were produced, the single pin was fine, but when they started introducing larger calibers like the 40 and the 45, they needed, extra rigidity there, right? So some of the very first Gen 2 40 caliber Glocks actually, I believe were blowing up, if you will. So they had to start putting two pins there. Now, the reason that the 9mm started getting two pins, I'm not sure it was necessary for the 9mm, but it was probably just a cost-effective way that all the frames, they started making, two pins there. So yeah, that's a Generation 3. The first thing also, this is the first time that you have a loaded chamber indicator here, right? Now it's not really a visual one. It's supposed to, it's, tactile, right? So when you feel it, you feel whenever there is a round in the chamber that sticks out ever so slightly. Another thing that you might notice is if you look here, right where the barrel meets the slide on the very back here, you can see right here, it's a perfect 90-degree angle there. This one is kind of canted off to the side, right? So, I don't know too much, in detail why that is, but that's just something to notice right there that I feel like only, people who are really in depth with Glocks would ever be able to see. So this one also has, newer sights. It's still the same UDOT design, but I'm pretty sure they started using a different material here for them now, because now they stay white. They don't start turning yellow, kind of like the original Gen 1 and Gen 2 Glocks. As far as the internals, almost identical to the Gen 2. It had the same captive recoil spring. And yeah, so those are the differences there. All right, now I also wanted to take the time to take a look at, some other changes that you don't see right here on the table. So with the Gen 1 and Gen 2 Glocks, they originally came in these Tupperware containers here. This one is the one for the Gen 1 here, so it's still got the sticker here. And, on the inside, it had a dedicated spot for the firearm there, mags. Yeah, so just these original small little Tupperware containers. Now with the Generation 3, they started making these, the Glock lunchbox, that people like to call them. This is pretty much from Generation 3 and on, every Glock that you buy will come in one of these now, instead of the original Tupperware containers. So now, we're gonna move on to the Gen 4. So now with the Gen 4, here we have this one. This one's a law enforcement trade-in one, so it actually has different sights. The Glock night sights from the factory, it's usually most law enforcement, they buy it with the night sights here, which are made of metal instead of plastic. But here's a Gen 4. So this one is the first where, I think it starts truly looking a little bit different. First off, we have an entirely new texture here, right? This one's, quite a bit more aggressive than the original pebble textures on the first 3 generations. Then this is the first time they the mag release is much larger than the old Gen 1 through 3, right? These ones are really small. This one is larger. And this one also is the first one that can be switched, from the left to the right, making it, ambidextrous. All right, so if you're lefty, you could put that on the other side. But yeah, so that's that. It's also textured quite a bit better too. It's just a lot easier to get to. And then everything else essentially is the same. So it's really just the texture. They kept the finger grooves. Internally, it's a little bit different than the Gen 3. The main difference being, I believe the sear is a little bit different in here from the Gen 3, but the main thing is this, sorry, I keep bumping my camera too. But anyway, the main difference is now we have a dual recoil spring here, right? There's a smaller spring inside and then this larger spring on the outside. So they went to the dual recoil spring. I believe they said the reason they did is, maybe recoil purposes. I think most people who have shot both Gen 4s and Gen 3s say that they don't notice a difference at all, but you know, that's just what Glock says. And then you still keep the same dual pin design here. All right, and then the other thing too that they introduced with the Gen 4 is now adjustable back straps. So every Gen 4 and newer Glock now comes with multiple back straps, like a medium and a large, or you can add a beaver tail to the end of this, whatever you want. It comes with straps so that you can make it fit your hand better. Me personally, I tend to like the grips just as they come, right? So there we go, the Gen 4. Now we're gonna move on to the Generation 5 here. So here is a Generation 5, right? We have the same texturing as the Gen 4, or at least very similar, right? The texturing looks very similar. However, when I pick up a Gen 5, it feels to me like the texturing is not quite as aggressive on the Gen 4. And I think people complained a bit on saying that the Gen 4 texture was a little bit too aggressive, so I think they toned it down a little bit on the Gen 5. But, you know, it's essentially, it looks very similar, right? They decided to get rid of the finger grooves, and then, you know, you still got your rail up front. It's still almost identical. One difference here with the Gen 5 is you'll see that the end of the slide right here and the frame, it's kind of rounded, right? If you look at it from there, kind of rounded at the end. All right, the first 4 generations of the Glock, they were not rounded on the end, see? And, you know, maybe that helps with holstering the weapon. You know, I think that's the primary reason that it's there. You still got the same mag release as the Gen 4 that can be swapped to the other side. And then a new slide release here. So this one is now truly ambidextrous. So if we look at the Gen 4 here, the slide release, you have one on this side, but you don't have one on the right. So now you have that on the Gen 5. Right. This one's another law enforcement trade-in. So it does have the Glock night sights. Remember, all the just regular versions of these came with the original U-dot sights, like this right here. So yeah, Gen 5. The other thing too is these early Gen 5s here, for whatever reason, they did add a half moon cut back. I'm not sure why they did that, but it is there. And then the other thing is they kind of flared the mag wells out, right? You can feel it in your hand, but they did that in order to make reloading a bit easier, you know, to kind of guide it in. They did some changes with the mags. We'll go over the mags in just a minute, but that's the Gen 5 right there. I believe the Gen 5 also they changed the finish once again. They call it the NDLC. And I believe, I don't remember what the N stands for, but the DLC, it's like diamond-like carbon. So yeah, one thing I noticed about this new finish is it gets, I don't know if you can kind of see on the camera, but it's really easy. You know, if you touch it, it's really easy to see fingerprints. You know, I find myself wiping down these later generation Glocks a lot more just because it looks like you can see the finger oils and fingerprints and everything on these new finishes, you know, a lot more. So yeah, so that's a Gen 5, is what I call an early Gen 5, right? Now, here's a late Gen 5, and this is probably the most popular one now. The only difference between a late and an early Gen 5 is these late ones, they started adding slide serrations to the front. You know, all the Glocks in the past only had them in the rear. This one had it in the front and the rear. So again, here's an earlier Gen 5, and here's the late Gen 5. Everything else is exactly the same between these two firearms. It's just they added those front slide serrations. So, and then one thing I forgot to mention also that was new with the Gen 5, or not new, but it, you know, changed between the 4 and the 5, is they went back to the single pin design. Even on their larger calibers, I do have a Glock 21 and 45 caliber Gen 5, and it has a single pin design as well. So, you know, I guess the manufacturing quality has gotten better, and they're strong enough now to support even the higher calibers with just a single pin. On the inside, it's almost identical to a Gen 4. You know, it's still got the same dual recoil spring assembly. So yeah, so that's the Gen 5. Now this one, so I've been waiting for this one to come out. Here is the Gen 6. Now, at the time that I'm filming this video, and maybe at the time that I actually uploaded it to YouTube, this still technically isn't out yet. It drops on January 20th, 2026, and which is 3 days from now from when I'm filming this. But I went to my local gun shop and they had a few already. So, of course, I went ahead and picked it up. So here's the Gen 6. This, in my opinion, I think is the most change Glock has ever done between all the other generations, right? So this one, you know, right off the bat, it's a bit different. We'll just start at the front. Just like the Gen 5, it's still got the rounded ends here on the slide. But you'll notice right off the bat, kind of like a Glock 47, it uses a shorter recoil spring than the typical 17. It basically uses a 19 recoil spring. So now the slide kind of sticks past the frame there. And the frame essentially is like a Glock 45 frame, which is basically the length of a 19 and the height of a 17. So yeah, so that's that on the front. The other thing they did was they made the slide serrations here quite a bit deeper. So it's even easier to get a good grip on that. Then going back, now all of them will have optics systems. So on the they introduced what they called the MOS system on the Gen 4, and they called it the modular optics system. So you could start mounting, you know, optics on top of your Glocks. This one is different now. They call it the ORS. So with the MOS, basically you had to get plates from Glock, specific plates depending on the footprint of your optic. Now, this one is already, they say optics ready. It comes with some spacers in here to kind of, you know, depending on what optic you have, but it allows you to direct thread any optic, you know, of any footprint of the, you know, the major footprints like Holosun and like the RMSC, that type of stuff. It allows you to direct thread them here. You still have to use a little plate, a spacer that kind of sits underneath the optic, but it's a lot better than the original MOS system. The other thing is completely redesigned texture. So this one is more aggressive. It feels even more aggressive to me actually than even the Gen 4. They decided to wrap the texture completely around. Also, they started adding palm swells here, so when you feel it, you can kind of feel it you know, fits in the palm of your hand a bit better. They also decided to bring the texture up. So the texture used to end right at the mag release there, and then it, you know, smooths out up here. But now they've brought the texture all the way up. The other thing is now they've textured this right here. It's what they call a gas pedal. And that's so that, you know, if you're shooting like this, you can put your, you know, your off thumb there to kind of, you know, anchor down the gun. You know, if you're one who shoots with your thumb kind of touching the frame, now you have a place to put it there. There's a ledge as well as texturing to help you with that. Another big thing is now they've undercut the trigger guard here. So these Glocks, you know, the undercut wasn't very deep, so it was harder to get a high purchase on the gun, right? This one is much easier, right? Because your finger can fit higher into that cutout there. Other thing is now a beaver tail just built straight into the frame. You don't, you know, in the past, in the Gen 4 and 5s, you had to use an additional back strap to get the beaver tail option, but now the beaver tail is standard and built into the frame. Other thing I noticed is they have widened the mag well down here even more. It's flared even more than the Gen 5, and you can really feel it in your hands. And then also, if you look at the mag release here, so if we look closely here, very similar, but what they've done is these were kind of squared off. What they've done is they've kind of rounded the mag well, or I'm sorry, the mag release. All right, so it's rounded there. It feels a little bit more comfortable. It's not quite, it feels like it almost might be a little bit smaller than the Gen 5 as well. Another big change here is, so every generation 1 through 5, they all essentially had the same exact 5.5 pound trigger. There's been minor changes to them throughout the years, but Essentially, they've all been pretty much the same 5.5-pound Glock trigger that some people love and some people hate. This one is technically the same trigger, however, they have changed the trigger shoe on it. So now it's kind of a flat-faced or semi-flat-faced trigger with a little hook on the bottom. It's still the same trigger on the inside. The only difference is the shoe is a little bit different. So it does feel a little bit different, but it's still basically the same 5.5-pound pull as the rest of the Glocks. Right? Another thing I noticed here is it looks like there's some material behind the ejector right here. If you look at this Gen 5 here, it just goes the ejector and then it just kind of rounds off there. It looks like there's another little piece of metal in there. Not sure exactly what that's for. And then some other differences that most people will probably never be able to see, but it looks to me like these Gen 5s, they're cut right here outside of the barrel. You can see it's straight and then it takes a little dip and then circles back up. This one stays straight right there, right? 90-degree angle and then curves back up. So those are the main differences there. So like I said, I picked this one up yesterday. Haven't even shot it yet, so I don't know what to think of it yet. Right off the bat, it feels great in the hands, but feel is definitely subjective. So yeah, so like I said, this wasn't going to be a super in-depth video, and I'm sure I haven't said absolutely every change that they've made. This is just mainly from the outside, the differences, some of the major changes that everybody's going to be able to see. All right, now I also wanted to take this time, now that we've covered every generation of the Glock, the firearm itself, I wanted to kind of show off the magazines a little bit, right? So I do have in this Gen 1, this is an original Gen 1 magazine. So the first thing it has is, they call it the U-cut magazines because of the U right there, significant U-cut. When you look inside, you can see there's not a lot of steel on the inside. It's mostly polymer, which the mags still are today, but the newer ones have a lot more polymer. All right, so this is a Gen 1 mag. It's got little, like dots right here. And then, the U dot, that's usually a way to tell that it's a very early generation magazine. Let me take a look. So the Gen 2 magazine was essentially the same, the early Gen 2 mags. So same U cutout here, not a ton of metal on the inside. Now I don't have an actual Gen 3 magazine to show, and then see, as you can see, it's actually, sometimes it doesn't even want to go in. Now for a Generation 3 magazine, I don't have a real Generation 3 magazine, as this Generation 3 in particular was, this one was made well after they started producing the Gen 4s as well, right? Because they didn't stop making the Gen 3 once they started producing the Gen 4. So unfortunately, I don't have an actual Gen 3 magazine to show you guys, but here's a Gen 4 one that now comes with any Gen 3 you can buy. As you can see right off the bat, quite a bit more metal in there. No more U-cut here. And then also to accommodate, the Gen 4 being able to, swap the mag release, from right to left. Now it's got little catches on the left and the right of the magazine, right? So that you can run it on either side. And essentially the magazines, they stayed the same, from late Generation 3 through Generation 4. Now with Generation 5, the magazines are essentially the same. This one's a bit dirty because it's been shot quite a bit, but the same amount of steel in them. Still have, cutouts on both sides. Orange followers, you can always tell it's a Gen 5 or newer mag by the follower. They're all orange on the new Gen 5s. But compare it to a Gen 4 magazine here. See, black follower, orange follower. And then the bottom's just a little bit different. On the Gen 5, you can see that the base plate extends a little bit on this one. It's also rounded when you look at it from this angle. So, not sure why they did that, but that's what they look like now. And the last thing I wanted to talk about is there are technically a few other generational changes that I don't have examples of here. And that is, the first one we call the Generation 2.5. So of course it's in between the Gen 2 and the Gen 3. Essentially the Gen 2.5 is similar to a Gen 3 where it starts having these finger grooves here, but it still doesn't have a rail for lights. So that's what we call the Generation 2.5. Now again, they're pretty hard to find, and I think most Generation 2.5s are in the 26 model, and I haven't been able to find any in the 17 model. Then the other thing, they call it the Generation 3.5, so between the 3 and the 4, and it's what they called their RTF2 texture. That's rough textured finish. So it's kind of close to a Gen 4. It's still at heart a Gen 3 gun, but they started introducing texture that's, you know, a little bit similar to the full-blown Gen 4 here. It wasn't quite as aggressive, but again, you know, harder to find. The other thing that it had were it had fish gill serrations right here on the back of the slide. So yeah, so that's been every generation of the Glock so far. Like I said, the Gen 6 hasn't released yet, but it probably will be by the time you're seeing this video. So I hope you enjoyed. You know, it's probably a boring video to most, but to some people, you know, it might be cool to see the differences. So I hope you've enjoyed. Have a good one.